The single most consequential claim embedded in the account attributed to Burkina Faso's leadership is not the alleged airspace violation itself, but rather the deliberate choice not to respond militarily, and instead to transmit evidence of the incident directly to Lagos. That decision, if accurately represented, constitutes a calculated diplomatic maneuver that reveals the strategic sophistication of the Alliance d'États du Sahel (ES) bloc, even as it simultaneously exposes the profound vulnerability of their military position. The incident, whether fully corroborated or partially constructed for domestic and regional messaging purposes, functions as a geopolitical signal directed at multiple audiences simultaneously: Nigeria, the Economic Community of West African States (ECOWAS), the United States, and the broader community of African nations watching the Sahel's continued drift away from Western-aligned security frameworks. To understand why this matters at the highest levels of strategic analysis, one must first situate it within the broader architecture of West African geopolitics, as it has evolved since 2020. The successive military coups in Mali, 2020, 2021, Guinea, 2021, Burkina Faso, 2022, and Niger, 2023, did not occur in isolation. They represented the collapse of a post-Cold War consensus in Francophone West Africa, a consensus built on French military presence, ECOWAS-mediated political transitions, and conditional Western aid as the load-bearing pillars of regional stability. The juntas that displaced elected governments in these nations have, to varying degrees, framed their seizures of power not merely as corrections of domestic misgovernance, but as assertions of sovereignty against a perceived neo-colonial order. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has been among the most rhetorically aggressive of these leaders in advancing this framing, positioning Ouagadougou as the ideological center of a Pan-African resistance narrative. The alleged Nigerian F-16 overflight, attributed to broader American strategic direction, must be read against this ideological backdrop. The United States operates a constellation of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets across West and Central Africa, with partnerships that include Niger's former Agadez drone base, a facility that Niamey's military government ordered American forces to vacate in 2024 following the deterioration of bilateral relations post-coup. The loss of Agadez represented a significant operational setback for American counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel, as it was one of the most strategically positioned drone bases on the continent, offering coverage across vast stretches of territory used by jihadist networks affiliated with both Al-Qaeda through Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin (JNIM) and the Islamic State Sahel province. With direct basing in the tri-border region increasingly untenable, it is analytically plausible, though not confirmed, that the United States would seek to leverage the air and intelligence capabilities of coastal partners, including Nigeria, to maintain surveillance coverage over the AES states. That Nigeria's role in this narrative deserves careful examination. Abuja has historically positioned itself as the hegemon of West African security architecture, contributing the largest military contingent to ECOWAS missions and exercising disproportionate influence over the organization's political direction. During the Niger crisis of 2023, then-President Bola Tinubu, who held the ECOWAS chairmanship, was among the most vocal advocates for military intervention to reverse the coup against President Mohamed Bazoum. The threat of force ultimately did not materialize, undermined by domestic opposition within Nigeria itself, resistance from Ghana and other member states, and the practical complexity of a military campaign across landlocked terrain. Nevertheless, the episode crystallized a perception within AES capitals that Nigeria functions as the enforcement arm of both ECOWAS and, by extension, Western interests in the region. That if Nigerian F-16s, a platform acquired under American end-user agreements and subject to operational constraints, were indeed deployed in a manner that involved overflight of Burkinabe territory, the political implications extend far beyond a bilateral incident between Ouagadougou and Lagos. The F-16 is not merely a weapon system. It is a symbol of the American Security Partnership Framework. Its alleged presence over Burkina Faso would constitute, in the framing advanced by Traoré's government, material evidence of the very intervention architecture they have been warning against. Policymakers must consider whether this framing is being deliberately constructed to serve a domestic and regional narrative, or whether it reflects a genuine operational intelligence assessment. Both possibilities carry significant implications, and they are not mutually exclusive. The decision to send the Burkinabe defense minister to Lagos with what was described as evidence of the incident is analytically notable for several reasons. It represents an attempt to engage Nigeria through direct bilateral channels rather than through multilateral institutions, a tacit acknowledgement that Abuja retains relevance as an interlocutor despite the diplomatic tensions generated by ECOWAS's posture toward the AES states. It also suggests that Ouagadougou is managing a delicate balance, maintaining the ideological coherence of the sovereignty narrative for domestic and Pan-African audiences, while simultaneously avoiding a military confrontation it almost certainly cannot sustain. Burkina Faso's armed forces remain engaged in a grinding counterinsurgency campaign against JNIM across vast portions of the country's north and east. Estimates suggest that as much as 40% of the country's territory is outside effective government control, an assessment that has been corroborated by displacement figures, humanitarian access restrictions, and the documented expansion of jihadist governance structures in affected areas. In this context, the opening of a military confrontation with Nigeria, even a rhetorical one, would constitute a catastrophic overextension. The Lagos diplomatic mission, therefore, reads as a form of strategic restraint dressed in the language of sovereign assertion. By presenting evidence rather than firing on aircraft, Traoré's government sought to occupy the moral high ground internationally while avoiding the material costs of escalation. This is consistent with a pattern of behavior observed across the AES bloc. High rhetoric posturing on sovereignty, combined with practical efforts to manage escalation risks and secure alternative partnerships. The partnerships in question, primarily with Russia through the Wagner Group's successor entity, Africa Corps, and with secondary engagement from Iran, Turkey, and China in various domains, have provided the AES states with a degree of external validation for their security choices, but have not resolved the fundamental problem of governance legitimacy or territorial control. The broader framework advanced in the account that Western powers are systematically attempting to contain independent Sahel nations while promoting dependency among coastal states reflects a geopolitical thesis that has gained significant traction in African intellectual and political circles, regardless of whether specific incidents like the alleged overflight are precisely as described. The concept of CFA franc dependency, French military basing arrangements under the now dismantled Operation Barkhane, ECOWAS sanctions regimes applied against coup governments, and conditional IMF and World Bank lending have all been cited as components of a structural dependency architecture. The AES states' withdrawal from ECOWAS, formalized in early 2025 after the bloc failed to prevent or reverse the coups through either coercion or negotiation, represented the most consequential institutional rupture in West African integration since the organization's founding in 1975. But that rupture has created a bifurcated regional order whose contours are still forming. On one side, a coastal-anchored ECOWAS grouping, including Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and the smaller Sahelian states that have retained membership, continues to function as the primary multilateral framework for trade, movement, and security cooperation, though with diminished reach and reduced credibility as a conflict prevention mechanism. On the other side, the AES Confederation has articulated ambitions for a unified command structure, a common currency, and potentially a joint security force. Ambitions that remain largely aspirational given the material constraints facing all three member states. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are among the poorest countries in the world by per capita income, face severe humanitarian crises, and are conducting active military campaigns against well-armed non-state actors who have demonstrated the capacity to strike at the heart of their capitals. The gap between the sovereignty rhetoric and the governance reality is wide, and it is a gap that both domestic critics and external adversaries are capable of exploiting. The role of Russia in this geopolitical reconfiguration warrants sustained analytical attention. The withdrawal of French forces from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was followed in each case by the deployment of Russian-linked military personnel operating under the Africa Corps umbrella, which absorbed much of the operational infrastructure and some of the personnel of the Wagner Group following Yevgeny Prigozhin's death in August 2023. Russian engagement in the Sahel is not primarily ideological. Moscow has limited historical ties to Francophone West Africa and no significant cultural or linguistic influence in the region. Rather, it is opportunistic, exploiting the anti-French sentiment and sovereignty discourse to establish a military and intelligence footprint in a region of growing strategic importance. The Sahel's geographic position, bridging North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, containing significant deposits of uranium, gold, lithium, and other critical minerals, makes it relevant to Russian interests in disrupting Western supply chains and asserting influence in a multipolar global order. However, policymakers should resist the temptation to frame the Sahel's current trajectory entirely through a Russia-West binary. Local actors have their own interests, grievances, and strategic calculations. The junta's embrace of Russian partnership is partly a function of necessity. Russia offers military support without governance conditions, and partly a function of the failure of Western security partnerships to deliver on their stated objectives. After more than a decade of French military presence in the Sahel under Operation Serval and Barkhane, jihadist violence had not been contained but had metastasized across an expanding geography. The political legitimacy of the intervention frameworks was fatally undermined by the perception, widely held among Sahelian populations, that French forces were protecting French strategic interests, particularly in the uranium mines of northern Niger, rather than protecting civilian populations from terrorist violence. This perception, accurate or not in its specifics, was politically determinative. The American strategic position in this environment is more ambiguous than the account under analysis suggests. Washington has been cautious about being drawn into the kind of overt interventionism that characterized French policy, partly for resource reasons and partly because of lessons absorbed from the Libyan intervention and the broader failure of military-first approaches to stabilization in the Middle East and Africa. The United States has sought to maintain lines of communication with the AES juntas, even as it has formally suspended security assistance and publicly criticized the coups. The Agadez base withdrawal was painful operationally, but was managed without a complete rupture of diplomatic relations. American officials have consistently emphasized that their primary concern is the deteriorating humanitarian and security situation, not the political character of the governments in power. Nevertheless, the alleged use of Nigerian air assets for surveillance purposes, if accurate, would represent a significant escalation in the American intelligence posture toward the AES states, and one that would carry substantial risks. The most immediate risk is to the Nigeria-ES relationship, which, while strained, has not been completely severed. Trade continues across the borders between Nigeria and Niger, driven by the economic realities of integrated communities that have existed across those borders for centuries. A confirmed intelligence partnership between Lagos and Washington directed against Ouagadougou would accelerate the hardening of AES external posture and potentially drive deeper Russian and Chinese engagement. It would also strengthen the hand of those within the AES states who advocate for the most maximalist interpretations of sovereignty, potentially foreclosing the diplomatic re-engagement options that remain narrowly opened. Nigeria's own strategic calculus in this environment is not simply reducible to American direction. Abuja faces a genuinely complex set of pressures. The security spillover from the Sahel, particularly the movement of armed groups across porous borders into Nigeria's northwest and northeast, constitutes a direct threat to Nigerian territorial integrity. The Boko Haram insurgency, now fragmented into multiple competing factions, including the Islamic State West Africa Province (ISWAP), has shown the capacity to exploit governance vacuums along Nigeria's northern frontier. A jihadist consolidation in Niger and Burkina Faso that creates ungoverned corridors extending toward the Nigerian border would represent a first-order security threat. From this perspective, Nigerian interest in maintaining intelligence awareness of AES territory is not simply a function of American strategic direction, but reflects legitimate national security imperatives that predate the current junta governments. This creates a structural tension at the heart of the incident under analysis. Nigeria's security interests may genuinely require intelligence collection activities that AES states characterize as hostile surveillance. AES state security interests may genuinely require the development of air defense capabilities and surveillance countermeasures that Nigeria and its partners would characterize as threatening. Both positions are, in their own internal logic, defensible, and yet their interaction produces escalatory dynamics that neither side may be able to fully control. Policymakers must consider whether existing multilateral frameworks, even the diminished ECOWAS, retain enough residual credibility to serve as a channel for managing these tensions, or whether entirely new diplomatic architectures are required. The multipolar framing advanced by the AES leadership, which positions their bloc as part of a broader global coalition of nations resisting Western hegemony and seeking independent development pathways, connects the Sahel crisis to a much larger geopolitical reordering. The language of multipolarity, sovereign development, and South-South cooperation resonates with discourses emanating from Russia, China, Iran, and a growing number of global South governments that have declined to align themselves unambiguously with Western positions on issues ranging from the Ukraine war to Palestinian rights to international financial architecture. The AES states have been active participants in this discourse, attending forums aligned with Russian and Chinese foreign policy interests, and framing their bilateral partnerships with Moscow and Beijing as expressions of a new, non-hierarchical international order. The strategic risk embedded in this framing is that it can become self-reinforcing in ways that limit the AES states' own agency. By positioning themselves as the African vanguard of a global anti-Western resistance, the junta governments incur the expectation of their new partners, Russia, China, that they will maintain that alignment even when specific decisions might better serve their national interests. Russia and China are not altruistic partners. They have their own strategic calculations regarding African mineral resources, diplomatic support in multilateral forums, and geopolitical competition with the West. The Sahelian juntas, if they are not careful, risk trading one form of external dependency for another, with fewer institutional protections and less domestic accountability than the imperfect democratic frameworks they displaced that on the question of ECOWAS. The organization faces an existential legitimacy crisis that the incident under analysis will deepen regardless of how its specific facts are assessed. The organization was constructed on the premise that regional integration and collective security mechanisms could provide peace dividends that no single state could achieve alone. The secession of the AES states has deprived ECOWAS of its most geographically connected northern tier and has exposed the limits of its enforcement capacity. If Nigeria, the organization's dominant member, is perceived by AES states as conducting or facilitating hostile military activities against fellow African nations, the prospects for any future reintegration or normalized relationship become significantly more remote. The window for diplomatic repair is narrowing, and the institutional costs of its closure will be borne not just by the governments currently in power, but by the populations of all affected states. The domestic political dimensions of the Burkina Faso account also deserve careful analytical consideration. Traoré's government governs a country in severe crisis, massive internal displacement, significant territorial losses to jihadist groups, a collapsed humanitarian situation in northern and eastern regions, and an economy under pressure from both sanctions and the structural consequences of prolonged conflict. In this context, the sovereignty narrative serves a powerful domestic political function. It provides an external enemy, Western imperialism, American surveillance architecture, compliant coastal states, against which the government can mobilize nationalist sentiment and deflect scrutiny from its own governance failures. The inability to secure the national territory is reframed not as a military or political failure of the current government, but as the consequence of hostile foreign interference. This is a recognizable pattern in post-coup governance across multiple historical and geographic contexts. This does not mean the narrative is entirely fabricated. The underlying grievances about Western policy in the Sahel are real and documented, and the structural dynamics of dependency that the AES leaders describe have been analyzed by serious scholars and policy institutions for decades. But the deployment of a specific dramatic incident, Nigerian F-16s over Burkinabe airspace, as the centerpiece of this narrative requires independent verification before it can be treated as established fact in policy analysis. The specific technical claim that Nigeria, which operates a limited fleet of F-16s under American end-user restrictions, deployed those aircraft in an overflight mission over Burkina Faso without triggering a broader diplomatic incident is not implausible. But it is also not confirmed by independent sources as of the time of this analysis. Intelligence agencies and independent researchers with access to satellite imagery, flight tracking data, and signals intelligence would be better positioned to assess this specific claim. What can be assessed with greater confidence is the political and strategic architecture within which the claim is being advanced. The AES states have a demonstrable incentive to surface evidence of Western-directed surveillance activities. As such, evidence strengthens their sovereignty narrative and justifies their security realignment. Nigeria has a demonstrable incentive to maintain intelligence awareness of security dynamics in neighboring states, given its own counterinsurgency challenges. The United States has a demonstrable incentive to maintain surveillance coverage of the Sahel despite the loss of forward basing, given ongoing concerns about jihadist activity and Russian strategic expansion. All of these incentives exist simultaneously, and they create the structural conditions within which an incident of the type described could occur. Looking forward, the strategic landscape in West Africa presents several trajectories that policymakers should actively monitor. The first is the possibility of further institutional fragmentation, including the potential expansion of the AES Confederation to include other states experiencing governance crises or dissatisfaction with ECOWAS's normative framework. Guinea, which has been under military rule since 2021 and is the subject of ongoing ECOWAS engagement, represents the most likely candidate for eventual AES alignment, though it has not yet moved in that direction. A Guinea accession to the AES would significantly expand the Confederation's geographic footprint and its access to Atlantic coastlines, altering the strategic calculus for both the coastal ECOWAS states and external powers. The second trajectory concerns the security situation on the ground in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, which will ultimately determine whether the junta governments retain domestic legitimacy regardless of their external alignments. The Russia-linked Africa Corps has provided tactical military support in all three countries, but has not reversed the fundamental trend of jihadist territorial expansion. Reports of civilian massacres attributed to African Corps-backed forces, including the Mora massacre in Mali and subsequent incidents in Burkina Faso, have generated domestic and international condemnation and have complicated the narrative of Russia as a more ethical security partner than France. If the security situation continues to deteriorate, the junta governments will face growing domestic pressure that no sovereignty narrative can indefinitely contain. The third trajectory involves the role of China, which has thus far maintained a more measured and commercially oriented engagement with the Sahel states than Russia. Beijing has significant investments in extractive industries across the region and has historically preferred stability over ideological alignment. As the AES states seek to diversify their international partnerships and reduce reliance on any single external patron, Chinese engagement in areas including infrastructure, telecommunications, and potentially direct investment in mineral extraction will likely increase. This creates both opportunities and risks. Chinese capital can contribute to economic development, but Chinese involvement in critical mineral sectors raises questions about long-term revenue flows and the concentration of economic sovereignty in the hands of external actors. The strategic assessment that emerges from this analysis can be stated with clarity. The incident described, the alleged Nigerian F-16 overflight and the Burkina Faso government response, is significant not primarily as a bilateral military episode, but as a crystallizing moment in the ongoing reconfiguration of West African geopolitics. The AES-ECOWAS divide is deepening, The American strategic position in the Sahel has been structurally weakened by the loss of forward-basing arrangements. Russia's influence is expanding but has not delivered security outcomes, and Nigeria faces mounting pressure to define a strategic posture toward its northern neighbors that serves its own security interests without becoming a proxy for broader great power competition. The risks embedded in the current trajectory are severe. An escalatory incident between Nigeria and one of the AES states, whether triggered by a genuine military provocation, a surveillance operation gone wrong, or a deliberate provocation by any party seeking to force a confrontation, could produce a regional crisis of far greater severity than the ECOWAS-Niger standoff of 2023. The presence of active jihadist insurgencies in the affected territories means that any interstate conflict would create additional governance vacuums rapidly exploitable by non-state armed actors. The humanitarian consequences for civilian populations already bearing enormous burdens of displacement, food insecurity, and violence would be catastrophic. The opportunity embedded in the current moment, narrow but real, lies in the fact that neither Nigeria nor the AES states have closed the door entirely to dialogue. The Lagos diplomatic mission, whatever its precise political framing, represents the continuation of a bilateral channel. ECOWAS, whatever its current institutional limitations, retains technical capacity and institutional memory that a future regional architecture would need to draw upon. And there are voices within all of the affected states, civil society actors, traditional authorities, women's organizations, scholars, who understand that the sovereignty discourse and the integration discourse are not inherently contradictory, and that African nations can assert genuine independence within frameworks of regional cooperation. Policymakers in Abuja, Accra, Brussels, Washington, and Beijing should treat this moment not as a binary confrontation between sovereignty and integration, resistance and compliance, but as a structural test of whether African regional institutions can adapt rapidly enough to remain relevant to the security and development needs of their populations. The answer to that question will shape the continent's trajectory for a generation. Sonnet 4.6 Claude.